Hi, I'm John Corcoran, Executive Director of the American Rose Society. We're going to wait just a few more minutes if you'll be patient with us as we allow other people to come in. We have quite a few coming in with such a large webinar. So give us just a moment and we will get started with the program. Thank you. I want to welcome everyone here today. I'm John Corcoran, Executive Director of the American Rose Society. I'm so glad you decided to spend this Saturday morning learning about roses and diagnosing pest problems of roses. Make sure also that you always check your inbox because we will have plenty of more webinars coming in the future, and we're so thankful Dr. Cloyd has agreed to put on this wonderful program. To go over the program, I would like to hand it over to Gary Chin to let you know how today is going to go. Gary?
Hi, welcome everyone. Today, our featured speaker is Dr. Raymond Cloyd, and his program is Diagnosing Pest Problems of Roses. Following Dr. Cloyd's program, there will be a 30-minute question and answer session. And if you're attended any of the recent webinars, you know the process. You enter your questions in the chat box. I will read the questions to Dr. Cloyd, and at the end of the 30 minutes, if your question has not been answered, you will receive an email response. Those of you who are consulting rosarians will receive credit for today's webinar. And if you're on with somebody else that's also consulting rosarian, please indicate that and you both will receive credit. So I'll turn this over to Diane Summers, who will tell us a little bit about Dr. Cloyd.
Thank you, Gary. And I just want to thank everyone for joining the April webinar of the American Rose Society. You're in for a real treat today, if I can call it that, when we're speaking about pests. I have actually had the opportunity to hear Dr. Cloyd in a number of occasions and really impressed with not only his knowledge, but his way to communicate and explain things that make it very easy to understand. Dr. Cloyd is a professor and extension specialist in horticultural entomology, plant protection, Department of Entomology at the Kansas State University. His research and extension programs involve plant protection and pest management in many different areas. He has published over 90 scientific refereed publications, over 900 trade journals, and over 60 extension publications on topics related to pest management and plant protection. And in addition, he has authored or co-authored numerous books. One of the favorites of mine that's on my bookshelf is the Compendium of Rose Diseases and Pests. He's a frequent speaker at state, national, and international conferences and seminars. And we are so very fortunate to have Dr. Cloyd as a partner with the ARS and his willingness to share his extensive knowledge. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cloyd.
Thank you, Diane. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody on a Saturday. I want to also thank Diane for inviting me to speak about one of my favorite topics, and that is pests of roses. Maybe not your favorite topic, but it is mine. And I'd like to thank you for allowing me to provide educational, non-biased, accurate information through many venues that includes the newsletter and today's webinar. And today's webinar is Diagnosing Pest Problems of Roses. Now, I don't put my picture up there, but let's see. Oh, I can't. can't move it. What happened? Okay, there we go. Okay, there's your speaker. That's me in Venice. That's not, and off to the right would be the Rialto Bridge. If you haven't been to Venice, I do recommend put it on your bucket list, but we're not going to be talking about Venice. We're going to be talking about bugs. I'm going to give you a brief introduction, then talk about diagnosing insect and mite pest problems of roses, and of course, we're going to have questions and discussion at the very end. So there are a number of publications, and roses are very susceptible to a plethora as our most ornamental plants out there. So there's extension publications. Here's one on insect pests of roses, and in there they talk about the various pests. We'll talk about the sawflies as we proceed through the presentation. So many pests. We can't cover them all, but there again, I'll highlight some other ones, and lots of good information out there. Here's one called Diagnosing Problems of Roses in the Landscape, and that they have a table with the symptomology, recommendations for management. And we will be covering spider mites, aphids, and thrips. Okay, but we need to go backwards a little bit and start understanding, which will help us for identification and diagnosing how insect and mite pest problems occur on roses, and then determine the extent of the potential plant damage. So number one is, what is the seasonality of insect and mite pest activity? We have insects and mites that occur early on, those occur in the summertime, and those occur in the fall. So understanding the season will be very helpful in diagnosing a problem on roses. Number two, what are the damaging life stages? Not all the life stages are going to be damaging the plant, and we'll talk about those, okay? Sometimes you'll get the adults, sometimes you'll get the larvae, sometimes you'll get both. And the last one is, what is the mobility or ability of insect and mite pests to disperse? And that's important when we're talking about movement from one plant or one rose plant to the next. Some other questions we need to answer associated with these insects and mite pests is, what is their life cycle? Okay, egg, larva, nymph, and adult. How many generations are there per year? Okay, and that will vary depending on temperature. What is the feeding damage? Okay, and that's part of the diagnosis process. Okay, where are they feeding? And then how do they overwinter? Okay, because why that's important is, if you have insects that overwinter as adults, they will come out earlier in the season, going back to seasonality. Those that overwinter later on in the season. And then the last one is, do they transmit diseases? And we will cover rose rosette. Okay, you ready? So this is where we're going. So let's talk about feeding types and how that's associated with damage. The major feeding types are sucking and chewing. And that's the feeding behavior. And that type of feeding behavior results in specific plant damage to either the flowers, the stem. The sucking insects and mites we'll cover first are rose aphid, thrips, rose leafhopper, and mites. Then we will get into the chewing insects, where they are removing plant parts. The sucking insects are feeding within the vascular tissues. That includes the xylem, which is the water conducting tissues, and the phloem, which is the food conducting tissues, or the movement of carbohydrates. Chewing insects are removing plant parts, flowers, leaves, stems, okay? That includes beetle, the rose midge, and the rose sawflies, okay? So first we're going to cover the sucking insect and mite pest, and then we'll cover the chewing insect and mite pest. So right off the bat, rose aphid. Now, when you're looking at diagnosing in insects, except for a few of them, they're very visual. They're on the plant, they're big, you can see them with the naked eye, but as you get older or senescing, that might become more difficult, but they're visual. And rose aphid is very visual, feeding on the terminal growth. And so, let me go over the biology though. So this is a general life cycle of aphids. So after they come out for winter, we have aphids that call the stem mother. And then they'll go through several asexual generations, which means they do not have to mate to reproduce. and we get winged individuals and non-winged individuals. And then as we go into the fall, we have autumn migrants. These are winged individuals. They will mate with a male, and then they overwinter as eggs. Okay, I told you about how they overwinter. Rose aphids tend to overwinter as eggs, whether it be the stem or especially during the dormant season, the stems or canes. Okay, so this is what we're looking at. These are rose aphids. Now, how do you identify aphids? Well, over here on the right, all aphids have what we call cornicles. They're tailpipes coming out of their butt, or more entomologically speaking, the abdomen. All aphids have these cornicles. That's where alarm pheromones are given off, and consequently, it warns the rest of the cohorts in the population of the plant or take defensive measures. Okay, so aphids typically feed on the new terminal growth, and the reason for that is because that's where the highest level of nitrogen is at. Well, why is that important? Well, nitrogen, composed of proteins and amino acids, are what insects and mites require for growth, survival, and reproduction. They also can get in open flowers. There you see, don't rely on color, because color is based on what the plant tissues are feeding upon. Pinkish or red, they can be green. So aphids cause direct damage by feeding on the buds and the leaves. But the indirect damage they cause is emitting a substance called honeydew. It's a clear, sticky liquid you can see on this rose here, and that is a substrate for black sooty mold. So when you see black sooty mold or honeydew, you have a sucking insect, in this case, aphids. In addition to that, ants are attracted to the honeydew source, and they will protect aphids from beneficial insects like parasitoids and predators, and they also will move them around on plants. Okay, so whenever you see ants or honeydew or black sooty mold, you got aphids. Okay. Also, as insects grow, they shed their old cuticle, and these are rose aphid caskins. They're not whiteflies. They're caskins. As aphids increase in size, they old cuticle and shed it off. I'm sure many of you have seen cicadas on trees, the old brown cicada nymphs. Well, that's the old exoskeleton where the adult came out of. Okay, so from a diagnostic standpoint, when you see honeydew, black sooty mold, ants, and caskins, you've likely got rose aphids. Got that? Okay. You know, this to me is beautiful, but this is how bad it can get, and there are all the caskins from the aphids. This is rose aphid feeding on the nice terminal growth, full of amino acids and proteins, and really having a good time. And there are the cornicles, or the tailpipes coming out of the abdomen. Now, you will see winged individuals, and that allows the aphids to fly to another rose or another plant part once the nutritional content has been diminished, and they will move on. Not really a benefit to the rose growers, but sometimes you'll have roses and sawflies feeding simultaneously. This is one of the sawflies. There are 3 of them, but they're causing this. They're chewing insects, so they're feeding on the tissues where the aphids are feeding, sucking plant nutrients out of the vascular tissues. So again, you can sometimes have 2 pests feeding on roses simultaneously. Not a very good scenario, though. Okay, now we talk about right is western flower thrips. They're about 2 millimeters in length, and you'll see them on the leaves. They primarily feed on the leaf underside. And the reason for that is because of their size, they're very susceptible to UV light sunlight degradation. Spider mites do the same thing, okay? This is the life cycle. The eggs are inserted in plant tissue. The first and second instar larvae feed, and then they drop down into the soil. And these are the pupal stages, a prepupa and a pupa. They do not feed on the roots, and they do not feed on any other plant parts. Come out of the soil, and the adults also start feeding, and the adults tend to feed more on the flowers, whereas the larvae tend to feed more on the foliage. Okay, So the damaging life stages are the first and second instar nymph and the adult. So what does the damage look like? Well, here are the adult thrips in the flower. Again, you'll find most of the adults residing in open flowers, and they cause a scarring of the tissue. We sometimes call it silvering, but it's mostly on a roses, we call it scarring. And what I recommend is if you have roses, I would shake the flowers over a white piece of paper attached to your clipboard, and the thrips will drop out of the flowers, and you'll see the thrips very easily on the white piece of paper. Now, this is what the damage looks like when they're inside the bud, and they like tight enclosed areas, and that allows them to feed without being disturbed by natural enemies like predators. So they're inside, and this is the start of the damage on the bud. Okay, and this is how bad it can get. So this, when you see this on a rose, one of the possibilities diagnostically is thrips, and you just need to open the flower, shake it over a white piece of paper, and you'll see the larva and the adults on the white piece of paper. They're typically golden yellow to green, whereas the adults are probably light brown, and some of them can be dark brown as they're getting close to reproductive maturity. Okay. That was the western flower. There are a series of thrips. The other one we have is a chili thrips. Now this one primarily feeds on the foliage, but pretty much everything I mentioned previously for the western flower thrips can pertain to chili thrips. But again, this is the damage. When you start seeing distortion, leaf curling, look on the leaf underside for the presence of the thrips. That's where they will be feeding, and you'll see the scarring of the leaf tissue. Their mouth parts are such that they scrape the tissue, and then and that's what they feed upon. Okay, they don't have rasping, sucking mouth parts. They actually have sucking mouth parts, but they abrade the leaf tissue, and they feed on the exudates that come out of that. Okay, so you want to look on the leaf underside. Maybe shake it over a white piece of paper attached to your clipboard to verify that it's thrips. Okay, so this is an insect that feeds both on the flowers and the leaves. On the buds, the flowers, and the leaves. Now, rose leafhopper is another interesting insect, and this is the damage we see on roses. This is called speckling or stippling. Now, leafhoppers are very unique as they feed within the phloem and the xylem. They feed on the vascular tissues, and they withdraw plant nutrients just like aphids do. Okay, so on the upper right here is an adult rose leafhopper. They're very mobile, and if you look on the leaf underside, you will see molting skins of the leafhopper nymphs. I showed you molting skins of aphids. Leafhoppers also will leave the residue, that is the molting skins, when they move from nymph to adult. Okay, so that's enough. So in addition to the stippling or speckling on the leaves, if you look on the leaf underside, you'll also see the cast skins or the molting skins of rose leafhopper. Okay, now let's turn to two mite pests. And their two groups are Tetranychus mites and Eriophyid mites. The major Tetranychus mite is the two-spotted spider mite, Tetranychus urtica. It feeds in the chlorophyll content. Spider mites do not feed in the vascular tissues, okay? They feed in the spongy mesophyll and palisade mesophyll cells, which I'll show you. Their damage is referred to as stippling or speckling, very similar to rose, okay? But the difference will be on the leaf underside is spider mites leave webbing, whereas rose leafhopper does not. These are warm season mites, and this goes back to seasonality. You will not see spider mites in the early spring or late fall, early winter, because it's too cool. They like it hot and dry, June, July, August, sometimes into early September, depending on demographics or where you're located. The life cycle from egg to adult, when you're at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, each female lays up to 100 eggs during their lifetime. So the eggs are laid, The larvae are six-legged, and then there are two nymphal stages, and they become adults. And again, when the temperatures exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit, this life cycle can occur in 7 to 10 days. That's why it's really critical to manage spider mites before they get out of hand. So let me go back to feeding. Spider mites are feeding in the chloroplast, so they're removing segments of the leaf. They feed in the palisade mesophyll cells and the spongy mesophyll cells. The xylem and phloem, that's where aphids are feeding. This is the water-conducting tissues and the food-conducting tissues. That's why systemic insecticides are not effective on spider mites because of where they feed. They will work on aphids and whiteflies and some soft scales, but not spider mites. Okay, so what does the damage look like? Well, this is classic spider mite damage. This is the cell that you see white has had the green content removed during the feeding process. Okay, everything is on the leaf underside. So again, take a white sheet of paper, attach your clipboard, shake the leaves, and you'll see the spider mites moving around slowly. Here are this is the male, female, the eggs, and here is the webbing right along the midvein. Okay, so just like thrips and aphids, most of the activity of their small size, they're easily desiccated by UV sunlight. Here's an example of a publication talking about the insects or mites that cause stippling or yellowing, and there's two-spotted spider mite. Stippling or bleaching, the leaves will eventually dry up and fall off the plant. Okay. And here's symptomology. Now this is what you don't want to see, but again, the symptoms of spider mites are going to be discoloration or bronzing of the leaves and eventually scorching. They'll eventually turn brown, dry up, and fall. And populations go unmanaged, which you're not going to do. You're going to deal with spider mites early on. So here is an example of the bronzing. And there you see some webbing, okay? And everything is on the leaf underside. So this is an example from a diagnostic standpoint of the bronzing caused by two-spotted spider mite feeding. Here is the stippling damage on a rose leaf. Again, everything is on the leaf underside. So there's bleaching and there's stippling. And sometimes it looks like a nutritional deficiency. This looks like an iron deficiency, but because they're removing the green content, the plant is responding to that by looking like iron chlorosis, okay? But if you look on the leaf underside, you should see spider mites. And sometimes it can get really bad. There you see when the populations start getting very dense, they'll start feeding on the above portions of the leaves. And then they will also feed on flowers. Not a rose you'd probably put in a show unless it was for a group of entomologists like myself, and then we'd be enamored by it, but that doesn't occur for most rosarians. But that's, again, how bad it can get. And I do have an extension publication you can download online on two-spotted spider mite, and it covers a lot more in detail than I can cover in this webinar. Okay, you can Google Kansas State University two-spotted spider mite extension publication, and it should be one of. Okay, now we move on to aerophyte mites, and aerophyte mites are very interesting mites. They tend to be very gregarious, meaning they cluster together. And here's a close-up of the aerophyte mite. Now you'll notice something. They only have 4 legs. Yes, aerophyte mites don't have 8 legs. They have 4 legs, okay? They tend to feed in the meristematic regions of the buds and also I would say, underdeveloped leaves. When the leaves are open, they tend to feed on the leaf undersides, but if the density is thick, they will feed on the top side of the leaf. So why am I talking about this mite? Because this is a vector of rose rosette disease. Let me give you some background. Rose rosette disease, or RRD, is a well-known infection of roses, including cultivated, native, and introduced wild rose species. It was first discovered in 1941 in North America. Manitoba, pretty much in the Pacific and the Midwest. It is now prevalent through most of the Midwest because of the abundant plantings of knockout roses. Knockout roses may be more susceptible, but the main issue is they're planted all over the place. So initially, the causal agent, we did not know what was the cause of RRD. But because of PCR tests and DNA and genetic work, it has now been called an amaravirus. It's an RNA, negative sense RNA virus, a areophyte mite. Well, that areophyte mite is Phyllocoptes fructiphilus. You cannot see areophyte mites very good with the naked eye. You need a microscope, high-powered microscope. But again, areophyte mites only have 4 legs. They're at the very end. There's the head. And at the very end is a structure called an idiosoma. That allows them to attach to a leaf, and then they are tethered around that area, and that's how they feed. Okay? So they are the... Do they transmit diseases is one question. And in this case, yes. Phyllocoptes fructiphilus is the vector of rose rosette disease. And again, there's a close-up. There are the legs, the mouth parts, and the idiosoma, because they're very susceptible to being moved around by wind. So they anchor themselves, and they just basically feed as they tether around. And as they're feeding, they can ingest or they can vector transmit the virus. So let's talk about fructiphilus Phyllocoptes. Well, they're spindle-shaped and yellow-brown. They're 140 to 170 microns long, meaning they're small. 4 legs. They're located between the leaf petioles and axillary buds. The reason why this one is in green is important about overwintering. Remember I talked about knowing how they overwinter? Well, adult mites overwinter on rose canes between partly open buds and rose stems and petioles. Why is that important? That's important because dormant oils can be applied in the wintertime, and they can cause mortality on the mites that are overwintering on the rose canes. In spring, the mites will migrate to developing shoots where females lay eggs. Females lay a single egg over 30 days. That's about their lifespan for the females. The mites can move around from plant to plant when the leaves are touching. They can attach to insects, and because of their small size, they can be dispersed by wind currents. Transmission of the disease occurs from May through July, with symptoms being expressed July through August. Now, that's not set in concrete, okay? Because plants will vary depending if they're stressed or not. And sometimes the latent period or the expression of the viral symptoms can occur several years after the plant has been infected by the areophyte mites. Okay, well, what am I looking for? Well, symptoms: rapid stem elongation, leaf distortion, leaf reddening. However, you remember that roses, their new growth is red, okay? Leaf chlorosis with yellow mosaic pattern, abnormal narrow leaflets or smaller leaves than normal, thickened stems, premature lateral bud development, excessive thorniness, not horniness, thorniness on stems, multiple stems produced at the end of branches, which is lateral growth may be larger than parent rose canes, and flower buds may abort, and open flowers may be deformed with fewer normal petals. Now, let me state, some roses will show 1 symptom, some will show 4, some will show all these. That depends on the titer levels of the virus that is inside the plant, okay? So just because a rose is infected doesn't mean it'll have all of these or it'll have thickened stems, okay? Very important to understand. But these are, from a diagnostic standpoint, what we're looking for. Again, you want to get it tested using a lab that can do DNA analysis to verify that RRD is in the plant. Let's go through some of these symptoms. Here is excessive thorniness, okay? Look at that. This is that the new growth is red and than the normal rose growth, okay? Now, that doesn't mean it's still RRD, okay? But it's showing one of the symptoms. And that's where you want to go send it off to a laboratory for verification. Here is the typical witch's brooming. And let me just state, roses that are exposed to glyphosate, Roundup, if you get drift on a rose, they will also exhibit witch's brooming, okay? So just beware of that. Witch's brooming, and here is the normal growth. This is the growth that has the virus in it. And again, here is a good example of abnormal growth, witch's brooming, and there is the normal growth, okay? So again, those are just some of the symptoms off that list I showed you that roses can exhibit when they are infected with RRD, which is vectored by Phylacoptes purified mite. I have an extension publication called Rose Rosette Disease, and again, it lists the symptomology and gets more into Rose Rosette Disease and what you can do than I can cover. I'm just covering the diagnostics. If you have a question, we can address that, but I'm just covering the diagnostic portion of this disease. And Oklahoma State, they have a laboratory that you can send samples to verify if or not, okay? And this is just one of their extension publications. Got that? Okay. Now, let's talk about chewing insects. And the first one is the infamous Japanese beetle. And when I was developing this presentation, I thought in the background, I should have music from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It would be very appropriate for this insect. This is the scourge of rose growers. Now, Japanese beetles are easy to identify. White tufts of hairs on the back of the abdomen. They are really beautiful insects. Coppery colored, metallic, would make great earrings. They're also good for in preserving, for show and tell. I think rosarians should get Japanese beetle earrings. Women should get it and wear it because I think they'd be really pretty. That is my own entomological perception, though. But they would be dead. Just think about that. So here they are. Let's go to the life cycle. Japanese beetle has an annual life cycle. They are mostly in the soil, and they are a turf grass pest, especially in August, September. But they're only out for about 3 months, 3 to 4 months as an adult. And you know, the thing I like about insects, they are extremely efficient. They don't care about cell phones or iPads or smartphones or Twitter. They get down to business. It's growth, survival, and reproduction. So when you're out for 3 months, business. And so what Japanese objectives are is sex and food, and sometimes at the same time. If you've ever seen Japanese beetles come out early on, this is an orgy. The female's in the middle, and you can see these two are hanging on to each other, okay? And again, they're feeding and copulating. This is not insect pornography. This is how it happens. But you can see the white tufts of hair on the back of the abdomen, okay? The damage. The Japanese beetle, they feed in between the leaf veins, calling what we refer to as skeletonization. They don't eat the entire leaf. They just eat between the main veins, feeding on the epidermal leaf tissue. And that's how bad it can get. You can see the main veins have been left, but they have fed on all the epidermal leaf tissue in between. Not a pretty sight, no. Here they are feeding on flowers. So in addition to feeding on leaves, they're flowers, and they themselves produce aggregation pheromones to lure more Japanese beetles. And then you have a situation where they're basically overwhelming the plant. And so this is a rose fed upon by Japanese beetles. Obviously not a rose you're going to bring to a show, okay? This is how bad it can get, okay? Now I have an extension publication. You can download it online, just like I showed you with the two-spotted spider mite publication on horticultural plants and turf grass. And it covers both the adults, mostly the adults, a little bit in the larva, and it talks about ways to deal with Japanese beetles. Okay, got that? Now we move on to another chewing insect, but this is a fly. This is a midge. The adult rose midge is on the left, and the larval stage is on the right. Now, in this case, the adult does not feed. Okay, doesn't have functional that causes damage, and the larvae have these sickle-shaped mandibles. Sickle-shaped mandibles that go back and forth, and they basically lacerate the tissue of rose buds. So the biology, the rose midge is a tiny yellow, brown, or reddish fly, which I showed you. The females lay eggs in newly developing buds or shoot tips. The larvae, or maggots, because they're flies, feed on the growing tips. New buds and shoots are deformed, turn brown or black, not very appealing. Okay. Abnormal flower development from damaged buds may also be seen. Sometimes the buds will stay closed. Sometimes they'll open halfway, and then they'll just fall off. Okay. If you opened up an area where they're feeding, this is the larval stage of the rose midge larva, and there's the head where they have those sickle-shaped mandibles. Now, this is an early instar larva, and this is a of the rose midge inside the plant tissues. They're very hidden. They hide. And so here on the left, this is the larva feeding, and they're basically using their sickle-shaped mandibles to lacerate the tissue. And then what happens is the rosebud folds over and it does not open. Okay. Now, I do recommend when you see the buds on the right, you open them up and you look under a microscope to verify that the rose midge was responsible, because we've seen hail, heavy winds, people picking at roses. They will also cause damage that somewhat resembles damage caused by rose midge larvae. Okay, so again, chewing mouth parts, sickle-shaped mandibles, lacerating the tissues, and causing distortion, deformation, and the buds either don't open or they'll actually fall off. Okay, that's fly larva. And you're looking at it and thinking, well, what's going on here? This looks like skeletonization, but more, it's actually, we call it window painting. There you see, this is not Japanese beetle damage, because if it was, you'd see missing tissue in between the main veins. This is called window painting. The lower epidermal layer has been fed upon, leaving the upper layer basically pale. That's it. So this indicates to me it must be feeding on the leaf underside. Okay, so this is another example. There you see the window painting caused by the sawfly larva. Now again, the adults do not feed, but they do lay the eggs in the plant tissue where the larva will emerge and start feeding on roses. Okay, so what is causing the window painting? These are sawfly larvae. They look three types of sawfly. We have the rose slug, the bristled rose slug, and the curled rose sawfly. Okay, they all do the same damage. They are feeding on the leaf underside, removing the undercoating of the leaf, and that again will give you that window painting appearance when you're looking at it from above. Okay, so this is rose slug and this is bristly rose. See, later on when they reach maturity, they will start feeding on the entire leaf. Okay, but as I showed you with rose aphids, they primarily are located in feeding on the underside of the leaf. Okay, So from a diagnostic standpoint, you'll see the damage on the top side, and the insect is on the leaf underside, just like spider mites and thrips and the other ones we talked about earlier. Got that? Now, there are other insect pests of roses, and because of time, I wanted to leave substantial time for questions. These are some of them. False Japanese beetle. It's on the left. Now, how do you tell it from the Japanese beetle? No tufts of white hair. Okay. Rose Schaefer, fuller rose beetle, Rose Curculio. There's a Rose Curculio right there. And these are weevils, and this is the snout, end of the snout, as are the antennae. Rose stem girdler, right there on the right. Rose stem sawfly, and then gall wasp. And the two major ones are mossy rose and spiny rose gall. Here's mossy rose, and there's spiny rose. Now remember, galls are not going to kill the rose plant because the gall farmer needs it, but it will distort the aesthetic appearance of the roses. Now, to me, I think the roses look a lot more distinct and have a lot of characters when they've got galls on them. Most rosarians would not agree with that. That's fine. Then the leafcutter bee, if you've ever gone out to your roses and seen your leaves looking like they've had, they're missing some leaves and it's very even, it's very circular, those are leaf cutting bees. And what they're doing is they're taking rose leaves and bringing it back to their colony and mixing it up, and that's a food source for their offspring. So really, leaf cutting bees are not really a major pest, but they can impact the aesthetic quality of what they can do to the leaves. Okay, we don't recommend spraying, but that's the way it is. Okay, so leafcutter bees are actually beneficial. They're actually pollinators, very efficient pollinators of many plants. Okay, and one of them is alfalfa. Their leafcutter bees are known for the ability to pollinate alfalfa. Okay, so if I was to give another presentation, I probably would. And really, in a sense, these would be the next tier. What I've covered earlier is the major tier of pests, but some of these can be very substantial pests. Fuller rose beetle, I've seen damage in California, and Rose Curculio, if they feed and are not managed, they can prevent the rose buds from opening. And then the rose stem girdler, once they're inside the rose stem, the only thing you can do is prune it out. Okay. So what you want to do is try to monitor and girdler in your rose plants. Okay. So what's eating my roses? So let's go over. There are two types of feeding behaviors: sucking and chewing, and that will give you certain symptomology that you're using for diagnosis. Okay. Know when the insect or mite pests are out during the season. Know which life stage is feeding. Is it the larva or the adult or both? Adult. For rose image, it's the larva. Okay. And this goes back to understanding, their life cycle, how they overwinter, and do they transmit a disease? Okay. So that's very important to understand for diagnosis. And by the way, these are the leaves that have been fed upon by leafcutter bees. How many have seen this? Yeah, that is damage. That's why I put it here, caused by leafcutter bees. Okay. I think it gives the leaves a, but friends would not agree with me. So our 16th president was very astute when he said this: don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. Don't rely on the internet for your information. Contact extension offices, the American Rose Society, university entomology departments. That's where you're going to get your accurate, unbiased information. Okay. The internet has a lot of unregulated, and I've gotten a lot of inquiries about people actually trying this, and I discourage them from doing it. So stop and smell the roses. I love roses too. but I do like them more with the pest problem, but that's my own perspective. So, as Diane mentioned, we have the Compendium of Rose Diseases and Pests, second edition, and I was blessed to work with Ken Hurst, who died last year, unfortunately. And I have been told by the American Phytopathological Society that the third edition will be out, but they told me that last year. So I just want to make, there is a third edition coming, and I was involved again with the insects and mites. Some new people took over for Ken on the diseases, but in late fall, I would say, early winter, be on the lookout for the third edition, okay? At least I hope so. So that's all I have, and I want to thank you for your attention. That will help you for diagnosing problems. And I want to thank the American Rose Society for allowing me to participate in educational venues to help rose growers. And I will continue that. I just wrote an article on two-spotted spider mite, Japanese beetle. I'm going to be developing one on rose aphids, and I'll be contributing articles to the newsletter. So I want to thank the American Rose Society. We have a good relationship, and I hope that will continue. If you have any questions or any comments, there's my email address at the bottom left. Comments, opinions, responses, ideas, advice. I am not prone to criticism. I use it as a means to advance or enhance my presentations in the future. So with that, I will be happy to address any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cloyd, for a wonderful presentation. We'll now go into a 30-minute Q&A session. Ask your questions in the chat box. I will ask Dr. Cloyd your questions, and we'll go from there. All right, Nancy wants to know, when I have a lot of aphids, why do the leaves get sticky and shiny? She sprays Monday, and they are back.
Okay, now that's a good question. Now remember, aphids are feeding the vascular tissues, and I showed you, as they feed, they will emit honeydew. It comes out of their anus or butt, and that's that sticky, clear liquid that is a growing substrate for black sooty mold. Now, in terms of spraying and coming back, when you're spraying, and I don't know what you're using, but let me give you some advice. If you're using a contact insecticide like a insecticidal soap or hort oil or any contact, you have to spray once a week. And you got to get thorough coverage of all plant parts, both the top of the leaf and the bottom and terminal growth. Any aphids you miss will still grow and feed and reproduce. So when you're using insecticides and insect or mite pest, number one is thorough coverage of all plant parts, especially fungicide. Number two is apply at least once a week, especially in late spring to late fall. Okay. And number three, before you spray, make sure your plants are irrigated the night before so they're not stressed. Plants that are suffering from an abiotic disorder like stress are prone to the insecticide or miticide burning them or damaging them. So thorough coverage, frequency of application, and make sure that your plants are irrigated before so they're turgid, they're not stressed.
All right, moving on. Catherine Tersey would like to know, what is a sufficient population of sawflies to damage health of plants? She does not like to treat, aka IPM, unless enough to do damage and not just a little cosmetic problem.
That's a good question. It really depends on two factors: the plant and maybe the location in your landscape. If you can tolerate some damage, that's fine. Unfortunately, sawflies don't have many beneficial insects. Ladybugs may not feed upon them, some green lacewings. What I recommend is you take a container of soapy water and just shake the leaves, and as they fall into it, they will die. I mean, that's not gonna, that kills them really quickly. You can just put them on soil after that. But regarding, it's going to depend on the age of the plant and the location and how much damage you're willing to suffer before it all becomes all of a sudden the issue becomes a major aesthetic problem.
All right, moving on. Maggie Lofbloom would like to know, what's the life cycle of the cane borer? I've always sealed my pruning cuts, but would love to know when they are most active.
That's a good question. The cane borer adults are out, and then they lay their eggs on the pruning cuts. The larvae enter the eggs and they enter the stem. And one of the best recommendations is put white glue on the cuts. That seals it and prevents the larva from entering it after they emerge from the eggs.
All right, Denise would like to know, how do you get rid of mites?
Okay, that's a good question. And so I'll take it from the lowest impact to the highest impact. So for mites and aphids, my first spray and dislodge them. They will not come back. It physically damages them. You want to get on the leaf underside, which is critical, and you want to do it in the early morning because you want to make sure that the foliage dries before the evening, because you don't want to stimulate an outbreak of black spot or rust or one of the foliar diseases. But you use a high pressure water spray. It's like using that nozzle gun when you would wash your car, okay? And that will dislodge the mites, including the eggs, larvae, nymphs, and adults. And you do about twice a week. That will alleviate the problem, okay? The next tier, insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils. And these are contact pesticides. So you're going to get good coverage of all plant parts. The soap is a desiccant, the oil is a suffocant. But the oil will kill the eggs. The soaps will not. But you got to get coverage of all plant parts and more likely make repeat applications. The third tier is using some of the common miticides, Avid, Floramite. I know Robbie sells them on Rosemania. The problem with those is that they will kill beneficial insects and you can stimulate a pest outbreak, okay? But they do work. But again, coverage of all plant parts, but mainly the underside of leaves, and frequent application, because spider mites during the summertime, I told you, can go from egg to adult in 7 to 10 days.
All right, Noreen Monahan would like to know, how do you tell the difference between mite webbing and beneficial spider webbing?
That's a good question. Well, the beneficial spiders will not create webbing on the leaf underside. Only the two-spotted spider mite does that. So that's how you tell the difference.
All right. Cynthia Crookstone. So now that we know how to diagnose, how do we treat for their damage? We need to know that information. Thanks.
Okay, now that's a good question. And when the damage occurs substantially, to treat or do something, you want to be out there monitoring. First of all, let me go back. So this is where understanding the fundamentals of life cycle, biology, which life stage is damaging is important, because you want to be proactive. You don't want to see damage from spider mites and start spraying because you already had damage. Well, you know spider mites are going to be a problem in the summertime. So go out there with a white piece of paper, attach your clipboard, and just start seeing mites. Then you want to do something, okay? Now for aphids though, you can apply a systemic insecticide. A systemic insecticide, you apply it to the soil, you water it in, and the roots take it up through absorption, and then it's moved throughout the plant by means of translocation. Gets into the areas where aphids feeds and kills them. However, you need to apply the systemic before you see the aphids, because once it'll take time for the systemic insecticide to translocate through the plant and get into the areas where the aphids are feeding. So if you know you have rose aphid issues, you want to apply your systemic insecticide before you see the aphids, okay? Systemics are preventative. They're not reactive, okay? And so for aphids, you want to apply them before they're present.
All right. Tammy Gons would like to know, what is the best treatment for pests?
Which pest?
Doesn't state that.
Well, okay, so the best treatment, there are two ways to look at this, non-pesticidal and pesticidal. I always lean to non-pesticidal first because environmental issues and pollinators and beneficial insects. But I would always be out there looking at my roses and doing scouting and monitoring on a regular basis. And you detect any infestations early on before they reach outbreak proportions. And if you need to treat for spider mites, you can use a soap, an oil, or high pressure water spray. Aphids, you can use a high pressure water spray or soaps or oils. Japanese beetles, hand pick, give them your neighbors, hand pick, or give everybody in the neighborhood a Japanese beetle trap. That's one of our Christmas recommendations. But again, you want to be proactive. The stage is starting and the populations are building up. It's really too late to do very much of anything except spray, but that's still not going to alleviate the problem with the damage caused during the feeding process.
All right, I've got a couple of questions related to thrips. Do you use beneficial nematodes to treat thrips? And what's the best way to get rid of thrips?
Okay, the first question is, we've done research. I am not a proponent of beneficial nematodes for thrips. The reason is they're highly susceptible to UV light degradation or desiccation, and they can be washed out plants. What I do for thrips is we spray a product that has spinosad as the active ingredient. Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew or whatever. I worked on that active when it was a numbered compound. So spinosad works. Orthene acephate works, but it smells. We don't release beneficials outside. They just don't do the job. So soaps will work too. It's like, but you got to get good coverage as well as oils. So oils and soaps, any product with spinosad as the active ingredient, or if push comes to shove, you can use orthene or acephate.
All right, I've got a couple of questions related to spider mites. Do you have any advice for treating spider mites? And let's go back down. What is the best way to control spider mites?
Okay, let's first talk about seasonality. The spider mites are out in the summertime. That's when you want to be scouting. So first you want to scout, and when you see them, what do you do? Number one is high pressure water spray. Dislodge them off the plant because you'll get all the life stages. Do it in the early morning because you don't want your rose leaves going into evening moist, and that will lead to a fungal problem like black spot, rust, or powdery mildew. Not powdery mildew, because powdery mildew doesn't need free moisture. So high pressure water spray, number one. Number two, potassium salts of fatty acids or horticultural oils. We like to use mineral-based oils, okay? Now remember, those are contact materials, so you're going to get thorough coverage of all plant parts and probably spray once a week. Number three, you can use some registered miticides like Floramite and others that are out there, Avid. I know Rosemania, Robbie sells some, Sandmite, Akari. Those are true miticides, okay? So that have to deal with termites. A couple other things to think about. Don't over fertilize your roses, because roses that are getting an abundance of nitrogen are going to be much more susceptible to both rose aphids and two-spotted spider mite, because there's a higher level or concentration of amino acids and proteins associated with nitrogen, okay? So don't over fertilize roses, and don't allow them to be stressed. Stressed roses from underwatering, overwatering, other abiotic factor, that rose is going to be a lot more susceptible to spider mites than one that has been watered well, fertilized well, has good air circulation, and is in full sun for at least 6 to 7 hours.
All right, the next question from Lauren. Can you suggest a general treatment program for roses to prevent or control these pests?
Yes, napalm is very good, but you won't have any roses. So I will Really, for most of the sucking insects, forceful high pressure water sprays will get aphids, thrips, leafhoppers, and the mites. The problem is the chewing insects, Japanese beetle, rose midge, and sawflies. You'll knock them off, but they can still come back. Okay, so if you're looking at a general purpose material, and that's a very loose term, I would use insecticidal fatty acids or oils. Now, those are not going to give you high mortality of Japanese beetles or probably the sawflies, but it will take care of the sucking insect pest. But that's about the extent of it.
All right, Megan and Maura would like to know what would cause stunted and deformed rose blooms.
Okay, what would cause stunted and deformed rose blooms? Okay, well, there are some abiotic factors: wind, hail, people handling roses. But biotic factors, I think rose midge would be one that causes deformed rose buds. Thrips could also cause rose bud deformation if you have high numbers in there. So from the standpoint of insect and mite pest, those are the two that would likely lead to a deformation of the rose buds.
All right, the next question is, what is the white fungus-like stuff on rose buds?
I'd have to see a picture. A white fungus, it could be powdery mildew. It could be. I can't really say because I have to see it. When you're doing identification and diagnosis, you got to see what's happening. And I do not do a diagnosis over the phone. I need to see an image. Okay, if I'm going to make an accurate diagnosis, and then that'll help me to. So I would recommend taking a picture, sending wherever this person is located, send it to your extension office and have them take a look at it and make suggestions or try to determine what it is.
All right, next question from Cynthia. How can you get rid of larvae in the soil?
Larva of what? Okay, let me, I think, so the two we're talking about, Japanese beetle and rose midge. So for Japanese soil, there are some insecticides you can apply in May or June, depending on your location, and you water them in. And when the Japanese female lays her eggs in the soil, when the larvae emerge or the grubs emerge, they hit that barrier and are killed. Okay, and there's a number of compounds out there that you can use. For the rose midge, you can put like a fabric barrier over the soil and prevent them from getting into the soil and pupate. Remember that rose midge and pupate. So you can stop that from happening, or once they're there, you can apply a material like imidacloprid, which is a neonicotinoid merit, and drench it and kill the larvae before they pupate. Now, once they're pupate, they're not going to be killed by any insecticide. Okay, so those are the two ways to deal with the two insects that I talked about that have a life stage in the soil. Now, for thrips, they're in the soil as pupa. There's nothing you can do to kill them.
All right,
But
next question is there a systematic?
I want to elaborate on that, though, if I can, John, is what you can do, though, is if you're dealing with thrips in the soil, rose midge larvae in the pupa in the soil, put up some yellow sticky cards about 1 inch above the soil. And when they start emerging, you know that they're coming out as adults. And that will help you determine what to do later on. And so that's what I put, a yellow sticky card and put it above 1 inch above. And when the adult rose midges come out or the adult thrips come out, they're captured, and that'll tell you that the adult stages are coming out of the soil.
All right, next question is from Henderson Marr. Is there a systematic pesticide you would recommend that is environmentally safe?
Systemic. Yeah, I mean, the systemic insecticides, I've studied them for 10 years. They're very useful for two reasons. One is one application will last you about 6 to 8 weeks, which means you're not doing multiple sprays, and that in itself is going to be environmentally, it's going to be beneficial to the environment. Number two, they're relatively safe to humans because you apply them as a granular, you water it, and they're in the plant. There's no residues on the leaves. The systemics, though, some of them can impact earthworms and some of the soil microauthors. That includes imidacloprid, the neonics, and also acephate. But the one systemic, and I think you can buy it, is aceleprine. Aceleprine is a IRAC insecticide resistance action group 28. It's got a very interesting scientific name, chlorinatropanol, and it is one of the safest insecticides. It does not harm bees and minimal impact on earthworm. And I know that you can buy it at garden centers. You're looking for an active ingredient, and I can't spell this out, chlorinatropanol, CHLORANTRINOLE, something like that. But that is one of our safest systemics in regards to the environment.
All right, Edie Osaka would like to know, how do you prevent scale on rose stems?
I didn't cover rose scale because of time, and I didn't even have it on that list. But rose scale is a hard scale. There are two types of scale. There are soft scales and hard scales. Soft scales, like aphids, produce honeydew, and then you get the black city mold. Soft scales are susceptible to systemic insecticides. The rose scale, which is a hard scale, is not. So when you start seeing scale, you want to apply a horticultural oil to suffocate them. And this is because you got to time it when the crawlers or nymphs are out. Once the females or males are on the stem, those sprays will be less effective. Okay, so what I recommend if you've had issues with rose scale is put some double-sided sticky tape on some rose stems, and when you start seeing the small crawlers and nymphs on there, that's when you want to spray with an oil. But systemic insecticides, let me repeat that. Systemic insecticides are not effective, and the rose scale is a hard scale.
All right, Cynthia Kirkstrom would like to know, if the eggs of Japanese beetles are in the turf, do we spray the lawn with the insecticide?
Yeah, okay, so there are several options. The Japanese beetle female lays her eggs in irrigated turf grass. If it's dry or less than 10% moisture, they don't do that. So what you want to do is you'll want to apply insecticide for June, depending on your location, north, south, and you water it in. Now you can apply a granular formulation or a liquid. I like granular formulations because they're safer, easier to use. Then you water them in, get them down to the top 1 to 2 inches of the soil, not the turf grass, the soil. And when those larva grubs emerge from the eggs, they come in contact with that residue of the insecticide and are consequently killed. Okay. Now, if you miss that opportunity and you've got grubs in August, September, and their third end star is a stage between each molt, then you have to apply a material called Dialox. The active is trichlorphan, and there are formulations you can get at garden centers. That only lasts about 3 days, but it will kill the larger grubs of Japanese beetles. But it's better to time your applications for May or June before the female lays her eggs, so you have that residue there, the grub larva, after they've emerged from the eggs, because the young larvae, like all insects and mites, are the most susceptible life stage to insecticides or miticides.
All right, speaking of the Japanese beetle, Edie Osaka would like to know, What's the difference in appearance of a Japanese beetle larvae and a grub? Larva, sorry.
That's a good. The larva is the grub. The grub is the layman's term, but they're synonymous. We call, if you read my publication, Japanese beetles, I say larva, and then in parentheses I have grubs. They're basically synonymous.
Karen would like to know, how do we prevent the chewing insects that you mentioned?
Really good question, and the answer is there is no preventative. The insects have to be killed. You spray the Japanese beetles, you spray the rose midge, or prune the damage out. The rose sawflies, they got to be there. There is no preventative. The only preventative is for the sucking insects like rose aphids, using and maybe rose leafhopper, using systemic insecticides. But for chewing insects, it's more when they're out there feeding or starting to feed that you want to initiate some type of plant protection program.
All right, Cynthia asks, will the granular insecticide be dangerous to songbirds in her feeders?
Good question. Okay, so once you apply the granular, you water it in, and the active ingredient comes off the carrier, which is normally talc or other. Once it's come off that carrier, then the material is innocuous or going to be not very harmful, or probably not. Yeah, but you got to water it in. You just can't leave it on the soil surface because it's not going to get into the soil. So once it's watered in, then it's going to be less harmful to any birds or any animals that eat the granulars after that.
All right, the next question from Denise. Does it matter what region of the U.S. your roses are growing? Or are roses in any region prone to all these pests?
If you're lucky, no. I would, okay, so, the California where I'm from, we had rose aphids. We don't have Japanese beetles. So once you get west of the Mississippi, west of Colorado, then Japanese beetles is not a major problem overall, but it is a problem from the east all the way to even Kansas, Colorado, basically. So depending on when you're located, you may not have all these, but the other thing to remember is if you're higher north, the number of generations will be reduced because of the cold temperatures compared to down in the southwest or southeast. If you say, for example, you're in Georgia, you'll probably get thrifts, probably rose midge, probably Japanese beetles, probably aphids, yeah, and mites. So if you're up in Minnesota, you'll probably get mites, Japanese beetle, thrifts, rose sawfly. So a lot of cases, you're probably going to deal with many of these pests I talked about, and those that were also others that were on that list, including rose scale, which I need to add. Rose scale, yeah.
Carolyn asked, if she uses oils for aphids, will she kill new buds?
Great question. Okay, so number one is, yes, oils will kill aphids, but you do not want to spray oils when the ambient air temperature is over 85 degrees Fahrenheit and the relative humidity, because that will lead to plant damage. So you want to apply in the early morning or late evening with an oil. You also want to make sure that your plants are irrigated the night before or day before so they're not stressed. And when I recommend oil uses, I start with the 1% rate, the lowest rate first, to minimize any potential plant damage to your roses.
All right, the next question pertains to rose galls. What makes the gall the plant's reaction to the wasp, or the wasp's ability to stimulate a gall with its ovipositor or something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the female lays her eggs, and the plant responds through hormonal stimulation to create the gall. The insect doesn't cause the gall, it's the plant response. So that gall is actually part of the plant. and then the immatures are developing inside the gall, and they're using it, they're feeding on the carbohydrates inside the galls, and then they'll tunnel out and come out as adults.
All right. Ginger would like to know, can a rose bush be saved if there's evidence of rose rosette disease?
Define saved. But that's a great question. Let me answer it the best I can. Some people will prune out the infested plant parts, but that doesn't mean the plant doesn't have rose rosette disease somewhere else. The only thing you can do is dig the rose out, and that includes the roots, and destroy it, because it's got it for life. You cannot. There are no viricides out there that you can apply. But then I get the question, well, after I dig the rose out, can I put another one in there? And if you've got all the roots of the plant out, you can likely put another rose in there. But you need to ask yourself, how did my plant get rose rosette disease? So you rose rosette either from another source or in the localized area where you're growing your roses before I would put another one in. Okay, that's really critical. But the answer is, once a rose plant has been tested positive for rose rosette disease, it's like a virus, and we all recognize viruses from the past couple of years. There is no vaccine or cure for a virus. In this case, rose rosette disease. Yeah.
All right. Karen has heard that beetle bags attract beetles to the garden. Is that true?
That's a great question. The studies that I have seen, reliable, robust studies have shown that Japanese beetle traps in urban environments will attract Japanese beetles. And let me explain. The Japanese beetle trap has a floral lure for the female and a sex attractant for the male. And so these traps are luring both the adults. But the Japanese beetle can fly 4 or 5 miles. So it can actually be attracted but stop and feed before it gets to the trap. And also, if you're irrigating your turf grass, the Japanese beetle females can lay their eggs in the turf grass before they get to the trap. Okay? So what we'd recommend is giving your neighbors these traps, but not you. And yes, they will lure Japanese beetle traps. You can get a high likelihood of grub damage in your turf grass later on in the season.
All right. That ends our Q&A session. Those of you who have questions that were not answered during this Q&A session will receive your answers in an email. Now back to Kim.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gary. Our president of the American Rose Society, Diane Summers, would like to close out the webinar with a few remarks. Diane?
Yeah, thank you, Kim, and thank you very much, Dr. Cloyd. This has been an extremely informative webinar. I know there's been a few questions about will we be able to see it again, and we will be posting it on our home. You'll see that on the homepage of rose.org under videos, and that'll take us about a week to get that posted, but you'll certainly have access to the recording. And as Gary said in the beginning, if you are a consulting rosarian, you will receive education credit for attending today's program. So we will be sending the attendance records out to the district consulting rosarian chairs. For all of our members, just wanted to give you a quick note that the May-June magazine, our American Rose, is at the printer. So hopefully it'll be in your mailbox in the not too distant future. However, you can go online and read it today. You just have to log into My ARS from the homepage of our website. If you have not registered before, you'll have to go through a registration process, and you'll be able to see that in your past ARS magazine, or you can just follow through that online. But you need to register first, and then you'll be able to see all of our ARS magazines, and we're loading other publications as well. And finally, if you're not a member of the American Rose Society, we sure hope that you join us, and we'll be sending information to you as well following this webinar. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Cloyd, for sharing all of this information, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, Diane.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kim.